Welcome to the How to Program with Java podcast, where all you need is the desire to learn, and you too can become a Java programmer with absolutely no knowledge of programming. And now, your host, Trevor Page.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. Welcome to the How to Program with Java podcast. As always, I will be your host for this episode, which is number 58. We are sailing along on our journey on or within Hibernate. And you'll have to excuse me, I meant to get this episode out to you guys sooner, but I have yet more news to announce on the podcast. Not really that exciting overall. Well, it's exciting for me. I've been considering for the past, year, 2 years or so, on a big decision that will weigh heavily on the next, hopefully 10 years of my life. And myself and now my new fiance have been, trudging along, trying to figure out the best decision to make for this particular new event. And we eventually, finally, this past weekend, actually not even weekend, this past holiday weekend, which was the Monday of this week, which was September, 2nd, I think? Yes, September 2nd. So 2 days ago, as of the recording of this episode, we decided to introduce a new member into our little family. We got a puppy, and to some people that might be not a very exciting event. Some people might say, why the heck did you get a puppy? But yeah, I had a dog earlier in my life, and it actually was an amazing part of my life. I was very, very happy with a dog as a companion, and I decided to take the plunge and do it again. So we found a breeder. We got a new puppy. She is a French Bulldog mixed with a Boston Terrier. Previously I had a French Bulldog, but unfortunately he died very quickly. He had a heart condition, and apparently that's fairly not normal, but not abnormal in terms of French Bulldogs, because they tend to have a lot of health issues. So I wanted to introduce a little bit more of a mixed breed into it, because purebreds tend to have a bit more issues, as I found out the hard way. So yeah, we got she is called a Frenchton, a French Bulldog mixed with a Boston Terrier, a Frenchton. And I just love French Bulldogs because they tend to have a very lazy demeanor, and I find them not attractive, but cute, I should say. Never refer to a dog as attractive. I tend to like the, smushed faces and the pointy ears. But in any case, to each their own. So yeah, we got this new puppy, and obviously I should have realized that puppies are hard work. It's been a long time since I've had to deal with a puppy, and of course, yes, she's a lot of work. She wakes up in the middle of the night crying. You need to take her out, and then she won't fall back asleep, and you need to spend time with her. And anyway, anybody with a new puppy, or probably a new child, it's even worse with a new child, I'm sure, can relate to that. So I'm a little bit later with getting this episode out. In any case, I won't bore you with the details. Let's get right on into the good stuff for today. Actually, before we do, really quickly, there were no reviews that I could see that have come in. No reviews at all, which is a little bit strange. So maybe I missed some or something. But if you are a regular listener and you haven't yet left a review for this podcast, I would love for you to go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/love, LOVE, and it will redirect you to your iTunes application, where you can actually fill out a rating and review for the show. By all means, please do, and be honest with your review. I will be reading any 5-star reviews. If you don't feel that this, deserves a 5-star review, then just leave helpful feedback if you have some. I actually have not received anything below a 5-star review and as long as I can remember. So I don't want to, trick you guys into always giving me 5 stars. Please, by all means, be honest. I want to be able to, give you the best podcast that I possibly can. But in any case, go on there, howtoprogramwithjava.com/love, leave your rating and review, and even while you're at it, you can click the subscribe button too. That will really help the podcast out, as it is in a growth phase at the moment, so I want to keep it growing. That will really help out to subscribe as well. So, All right, let's get into the business end of this podcast, which is all about Hibernate. Again, we're still on the topic of Hibernate, and today we're going to be talking about what's known as the life cycle of essentially an object in terms of the Hibernate, in perspective of the Hibernate framework. So, for those of you who haven't heard anything about Hibernate yet, you definitely need to go back a few episodes. Probably, how many have I done here? Maybe 5 episodes or so that have been dedicated to Hibernate. If you know nothing about databases, and you probably need to go back 10 episodes or so to the beginning of when I started talking, about databases in general. But for those of you who are caught up, then we're going to be talking about sort of the life cycle of an object and how it goes through the Hibernate code and how Hibernate treats the objects and what neat things that Hibernate does with those objects. So, life cycle of a Hibernate object, if you will, is going to be the topic for today. So let's paint the picture. Let's have the blank slate. We are dealing with, let's say, a plain old object. And let's say we have managed to integrate into this object some Hibernate code. So we're able to get a Hibernate Sessionfactory in our object in some way, shape, or form. Usually this is done through Spring. I use Spring to manage all of my Hibernate stuff. But, I mean, if you don't want to use Spring, you don't have to. There's certainly ways to be able to embed Hibernate code into a plain old Java object without having to use something like automatic wiring that we use inside of Spring. But in any case, you can absolutely create Sessionfactory on its own, instantiate it, and sort of deal with the transaction management all on your own. But inside of Spring, it handles it for you with one easy annotation. You just have to annotate your class with the at transactional. Sorry, don't say transient. That's a bad word to put into there. At transactional is what you would put in the class level, and that will handle all the transactional sort of code, what we call the boilerplate code. Boilerplate code is code that you need to write over and over and over again. It's very repetitive type of code, and it's that code where it's like, oh God, I wish I could just have it handled for me by something else, so I don't have to put all these millions of lines of code that's just boilerplate code into my actual program. That's what Spring does for you, is eliminates the need for that boilerplate code. In any case, let's paint the picture of having a plain old Java object, and let's say, for the sake of argument, that we are inside of using the Spring framework. But what I'll do for you is I'll fill in the blanks of what the Spring framework does for us, so that you can sort of understand this life cycle properly. So we have a new class. We have it annotated with our transactional annotation, and it's also been marked as a repository because obviously that's important. We're talking about DAOs right now, data access objects, and it's annotated with at repository. So Spring knows it's a DAO type object, and then Spring knows it's supposed to be transactional, so it'll make all the methods transactional inside of this class. So then we are going to have an auto-wired Sessionfactory embedded into our class, and that's going to be an instance variable. So we're going to have an instance variable called Sessionfactory. It's going to be auto-wired, which means that Spring will take care of the instantiation of a Sessionfactory and will wire it in automatically to our class so that we can use it inside of our methods. So let's say the example that we're talking about today, I'll keep it simple and talk about users. Let's say we just want to have someone has created a user account and they want to persist their user account. So let's say that they've signed up, they've registered for your application. It would be just like registering for Facebook for the first time. You give your username, your email, your password, your birth date, whatever it is that you need. Let's say that this data is being passed into our DAO object, and it's being passed in there because it needs to be persisted. So again, we're talking about life cycle stuff. So what is the life cycle of our object? Well, what happens is typically in a normal use case, so in a normal scenario with Hibernate and Spring, what happens is you make a reference to a DAO class. You make a reference to a data access object, and usually you reference a save method. So let's say you're inside of your controller or you're inside of a service class or something like that, depending on how you've set up your programming, your application. Typically, it's done in a service method. So typically, like I said, you separate your concerns. This is something I said way back when. You have inside of your controller code deals with the the request that comes in, and it handles what to do with that request. And typically, it delegates the request with whatever parameters that were sent into that request to a service layer. So the service layer will take that code and take those objects or whatever it is that's being passed in, and then do something with it. And typically the do something with it is what I'm talking about right now, which is where we're saying, okay, we want to persist this object. So typically, the service class will take the objects and make sure that, first of all, it is free from error. Okay, and I'm kind of repeating myself here. This is something I've talked about, like I said, ages ago. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that we want to, repeat the past and repeat a lesson. So let's say we get a user object. The user in question is, let's say, Trevor Page is the username, and the email address is, Trevor or something, or no, info, I guess, info@howtoprogramwithjava.com, and the password is, password 123. And that's the object, that's the full representation of the user object. So with this user object in our service method, in our service class, we'll typically check to make sure that all the values that should be populated have been populated. So we'll check and make sure that it has a username, and it will check and make sure that it has set a password and all that kind of stuff. And then we will invoke a save. Okay? So this is the start of the life cycle of a Hibernate object. Okay? And I call it a Hibernate object. It's a Java object, but it's being used as an object in correlation with the Hibernate framework. So from now on, I'll refer to it as a Hibernate object, but just for you to know, it is definitely not it's not something special. It's just a plain old Java object that you've seen many times before. It's a user class with instance variables being set, username, password, email address, with getters and setters. Okay, that's the Java object that we're talking about. But I'll refer to it as a Hibernate object because we're talking about the Hibernate lifecycle here. So we're in the service class, and we say we want to save this particular object. So we want to save it to our database. We want to persist it to our database. Well, as it stands right now, at the moment that we are calling the save method, the object in question is known as a transient object. Okay, so this is the first concept I'm introducing you to in the life cycle of this object as it pertains to Hibernate. So it's a transient object because Hibernate is not yet familiar with it at all. Hibernate does not know what this object is. It does not know if it exists in the database already. It does not know if it should exist or that you want it to exist in the database. It knows nothing about the object. They refer to that as transient. Transient means it's completely separate from the database as an entity in itself. There's no correlation between this object and the database whatsoever. That is a transient object. You can even have transient fields. So you can have a transient, what's it called? Instance variable. Okay. You can mark an instance variable as transient if you like. You can even use a special annotation called @transient. Okay. So you use that @transient annotation on a field, on an instance variable, if you just don't want it to be associated to a database at all. So let's say, for example, we can have, some sort of field in a user object that we just wouldn't want to persist. So maybe, I'm putting myself on the spot here because I haven't even thought of an example for this. Let's just say for the sake of argument that it's a rating. Let's say that you give your own personal rating to each of your users. Okay, maybe you base it on some sort of criteria that, who knows, maybe, how interactive the user is, how many questions, how many times the user's contacted you, how many times the user logs in every week. You could have all these different criteria that you would use to base to create an actual empirical figure, an actual number, a metric to this person, and you want to keep their rating. So fair enough. Let's say we don't want to persist this rating for one reason or another. Maybe you never want your users to be able to see that rating because it's just for yourself. You would mark your rating instance variable as transient. Typically, you do that on the getter method. Again, you want to make sure that you put everything on the getter method level. So you would put the @transient annotation on your getter method for that particular field, for that rating field. And then that tells Hibernate to ignore it. Okay, so that's sort of a different topic. I've kind of gone on a bit of a tangent here, but it's the same concept. Transient, it means completely separate from the database. The database completely does not know what the heck is going on with that particular object or method or what have you. Okay, transient. So back to the life cycle. So we have asked the service method to actually persist this object via the save. So we'll invoke the DAO's save method. And so fair enough. Like I said, this object, this user object that we're passing in to the service or to the DAO is transient before it gets into the actual DAO. Okay. But what happens is as the code flows along, it will go into the actual sort of the code that you don't see happening, which is the code that Spring handles for you. This is the boilerplate code. So what happens is Spring will instantiate and start up a new session for you. Okay, not session, sorry, bad word. Transaction. Spring will start a transaction for you because you've marked it as transactional. Okay, you've used the @transactional annotation, so it will start a transaction for you inside of your method. Okay, as it needs to happen. So that's done on your behalf because you don't want to have to write out this boilerplate code. So now we've opened up a transaction. So this is the first step to taking our object into the next phase of the life cycle of this Hibernate object. Okay, we haven't reached that new stage yet, but that's a critical first step, is to establish and create our transaction. Okay, so now inside of our DAO code, inside of our save method, we will have a reference to the Sessionfactory, and we'll get the current session from the Sessionfactory. And this will be woven into our transactional context. So we'll have access to the session, which is already inside of a transaction, which is a good thing. So, fair enough. But now what we do is we say session.save, and then we pass in our object. Okay, the object in question is the user object, which is still currently a transient object in the scope of the lifecycle of Hibernate. Okay, so fair enough. Now what happens is it will hit the save method, or this could be the save or update method, which is, I'm not sure if I've really gone into detail about the difference between those two. I probably have. I can't remember off the top of my head right now. Certainly a topic for further discussion in a later episode if I haven't already talked about the difference. But for now, let's just assume we're saving the object. We're putting it into the database. That's all we need to know. So we are invoking the save method within the DAO. After that happens, once the session.save method is invoked and we've passed in our user object. Okay, and it actually carries out, it performs its action, its required action, which is to save this particular object to the database. Once that occurs, the actual object makes a change. It changes from the transient state to the persistent state. Okay, transient is the first state, persistent is the second state. So persistent means Hibernate is fully aware of this object now. Hibernate has its eyes wide open. It's got its, eye strictly, pointed at this particular object. To nerd out for a second, it's got the eye of Sauron pointed at this object. I apologize for being too nerdy. Lord of the Rings reference there. So the Hibernate eye is on this object, so it's persistent now. So what happens now with this object is, while we are inside of the transactional context, okay, which means that we are inside of, the transaction has been started, it's been opened, and it has not yet been closed. When we are inside of that magical area, and while this object is persistent, Hibernate is very interested in what's happening with this particular object. If any changes are made to this object, once it's persistent, okay, Hibernate knows about it. It wants to stay synchronized with what's going on inside of that object. Okay, that's sort of it's a property of, or functionality of Hibernate, is to stay synchronized while the object is persistent. Okay, it's a really neat bag of tricks it's got, Hibernate. Hibernate has a really neat bag of tricks when it comes to persistent objects. So what happens now is when we close the transaction, Hibernate will take that object that's in the persistent state and it will actually persist it to the database. Okay. Now, you might have already said, well, we've already persisted it to the database. We already invoked the save. That's true, but if you make any changes after the save and you close the session, or not the session, you close the transaction, it will still update the object. It will still persist any changes that have been made. Now, in a typical workflow, this does not happen. Typically, in our code, when we have our DAOs, the DAOs just take in the object, they start the session, they get the current session, they persist it to the session, they persist it to the database via the session, and then that's it. That's all they do. Typically, we don't modify the object after we've invoked a save, okay? And again, this is after we've invoked a save, after we have done whatever it is we need to do, but we're still inside of the scope of that DAO's method, which means we're still inside the scope of the transaction. Typically, we don't make any changes afterwards, but who knows what the heck you are doing in your code or what the heck some other programmer is doing in their code. I want you to be fully versed and understand exactly what's going on here with the persistent state of an object. Okay, so it's persistent, which means any changes you make, regardless of if you say .save again or not, Hibernate will persist those changes. So hypothetically speaking, we come in, we do our Sessionfactory.getCurrentSession. We have that session, we say session.save, we give it the user object. Okay, it will persist it to the database. Okay, it does its insert statement into the database. Fantastic that the user is now in the database. They're fully registered. Great. But then we say user.set username and then change it. So maybe they change it from Trevor Page to just T Page. Okay. Again, this is not a common thing that happens, but I want you to be fully versed, in what's going on here. So we change the username. And then that's all we do. We just change the username and we let the method close itself as normal, and we exit the DAO. So what happens there? Well, when we exit the method, when the method is completed and closed, the @transactional kicks back into gear. So this boilerplate code has already been inserted that we don't even see, that's happening, that we can't even see behind the scenes. Okay, that's via the Spring framework. And again, this is a good thing. We want our boilerplate code to be handled by some other thing, some other framework, some other entity, okay? It's a good thing to not have to write out boilerplate code. But, like I said, the magic behind what's going on might be hidden from your eyes, so I want to make it seen by you. So, Hibernate, the method ends, we're done our DAO's method, the save method. Hibernate will kick into gear again via Spring's @transactional annotation, and it will close the session, or close the transaction, okay? Again, I keep getting those mixed up. Transactional context is what Spring is doing for us, which is the boilerplate code. So the transaction is going to be closed, but then Hibernate, because we're closing the transaction, Hibernate says, okay, I need to synchronize my objects here that are currently in the persistent state. So whatever objects are in persistent state, we're closing the session or the transaction. So whatever object which was in a persistent state inside of this transaction, we need to synchronize. So because we said user.set, set username to be tpage, it will actually update that particular row of data. It'll update it to have the correct username, which is what we've changed it to. So even though we haven't invoked a second save method, we haven't said, session.save again, Hibernate will still save it. Okay, so that's one little trick that Hibernate has up its sleeve. And that's because of the persistent state of the object. That's the persistent part of the life cycle of this Hibernate object. Okay? When it's persistent, it will keep it synchronized. So very, very cool stuff there. Okay, so then what happens? It closes the transaction, and then what happens to this object? What happens to my my user object? Well, it makes another change, another step in the life cycle. It goes from persistent to being detached. Okay, so we have a detached object, and it's a detached object because, like I said, we've closed the transaction. So this whole life cycle is really inside of the scope of a transaction. Okay, that's really what I'm talking about. The life cycle of a Hibernate transaction. Okay, that's a key word I've been missing that I should have been saying that I haven't been, but I'm saying it now. So the Hibernate transaction life cycle. Once we have closed the transaction, we are now moving that same user object into the detached state. Okay, which means if we make any changes to this detached object, Hibernate will not persist them. Okay, so if you make you update the first name or the username or the password or whatever inside of this user object, Hibernate doesn't care anymore because it's detached. The transaction is closed. Everything, they close up shop. The eye of Sauron, the eye of Hibernate is now no longer on this particular object because it has moved from persistent to detached. Okay, so fair enough. Now what do we do, right? Now where do we go from here? Well, in a typical scenario, we're done. Okay, we've saved our object to the database. We can now sort of get rid of this object. We don't care about it anymore because it's been saved to the database and we can move on with our lives. Okay, now that's the probably, I don't know, maybe 60-70% of the time, that's what happens. Now, the other half, or the other whatever percentage amount of time that arises, we actually need to work with that object and actually make changes to it and persist those changes again. Now, this is where a gray area happens. And I call it a gray area because this is an area that really perturbed me for a long time. It really ate away at my soul, my core being, because I didn't understand the life cycle of Hibernate, of objects in Hibernate and within the transaction and everything. Because I didn't see the transaction, it was obscured from me via the at transactional annotation that Spring uses, which, like I said, is very helpful. But obviously, when you slowly take away the boilerplate code, you lose something in the process. You lose the knowledge of what's going on in the background. So now that I'm fully aware of this knowledge, I fully understand what the problem was that I was running into. So here's the problem. Okay, you have a user object, you've saved it, you've left the DAO, it has now become detached, and then somewhere down the line, okay, let's say the user has been saved, and let's say the user now goes in, logs into the system with that same user ID. Let's say they go to their account page. Let's say we have an account page, who knows, and they change something, and they update their password, okay, and they update their password. They say they want to change it from this old value to this new value, and they say save. Now, what happens is, if you use that same object in memory, that same detached object, and you try to say, okay, well, they've updated their password, so now I'm going to say, change the password to be this, and I want to save it. What ends up happening is, if you have a detached object and you try to save it again, you're in a situation where, well, a couple things can happen. One thing that can happen is nothing goes wrong. You save the object, Hibernate's perfectly okay with it, and everything's peachy keen, and you can go along about your business as usual, which actually happens a lot as well. But what typically happened with me in this scenario is I had a lot of relationships going on inside of that object. So that user object was related to, I don't know, login history object and this and that. A whole bunch of different objects were all tied in. And what happens is it gets out of sync. Okay, all these other objects have changed, and you try to invoke a save on this detached object, and Hibernate just doesn't know how to save this object. Okay, and it throws an exception. I can't remember what exception it is off the top of my head right now, but Hibernate says they're out of sync. You're using a detached object. There's another object that's already inside of the session that has the same identifier. So in other words, Hibernate still kind of has inside of the back of its mind this user object with this user ID that's been saved, and you're now invoking a save on the same user ID object, and it doesn't know what to do because it's out of sync. So it throws an exception. It says, I don't know what you want me to do with this stuff. I don't know how to properly save all this stuff together, so I'm just going to throw an error and leave it up to you. So I kept getting this error, and it was driving me mad. So eventually what I learned was you can invoke something called a merge. Okay? So if you want to take an object from the detached state back into the persistent state or stage, you need to use the merge. Okay. Now, like I said, you can get away with using the save method. Actually, I think it's called save or update, or you can get away with just calling the update method. Again, usually when you go from a detached state back to a persistent state, you need to use the update method. But like I said, sometimes it can get so out of sync that Hibernate doesn't know how to update this object, so it throws this error. But you can use something called a merge. So what Hibernate will do is it will just take what you have given it. So you take the new user the new user class, okay, the new user object with whatever it is that it has inside of it. You invoke the merge, and Hibernate just says, okay, I'll take your word for it. Everything that you have in this particular object, I'm just going to take it and overwrite everything that's already in the database. Okay, so whatever my user ID, this object is, let's say it's, Trevor Page is the username, so it's user ID 1. Whatever other information goes along with this user object, I'm just going to completely destroy everything in the database and merge and set everything into being a new value based on this object that I have right now. And then I can bring it back into the persistent state. Okay, so that's where I was running into problems. I had to use the merge method because there were so many changes that Hibernate just couldn't handle it with a regular old update method. Okay, so when we go from detached to persistent again, is a bit of a tricky thing. There's some sort of a gray area, and you need to be smart about it. You need to understand what you're doing when you're merging the actual code, or versus just invoking an update. Okay, there's a difference between the two. I don't want to get into the nitty gritty there because this, we're already 32 minutes into this episode, and I'm not really an expert at this stuff. I can't really go into all the details, and I don't want to give you any invalid information here. But I just want to load you up with the knowledge that I have in my head. And that is that when you get to the level of having very complex objects and relationships inside of those objects, and you want to update them inside of your code, so change them from an already, they already exist in the database and you want to update them, typically a merge is best. Okay, it gets rid of a lot of headaches, a lot of bugs, and you use the merge, but you need to understand what happens. It's going to be updating everything inside of that object to be, or inside of the database to reflect what's inside of the object that you just gave to it. Okay, cool. So in other words, you need to make sure the object you give to it is correct. Okay, cool. So let's that's more or less the workflow. That's more or less the life cycle, so to speak. But there are different ways to sort of move in between each of the states. So, we talked about going from a transient object to a persistent object via saving it, right? We talked about creating a brand new user and saying save, and then it went from a transient object, remember transient is the very beginning stage, to a persistent object, okay? Now, we did that using the save method, but you can also go from a transient object to a persistent object via another means, and that is using the get or load methods. And actually, there's plenty of other methods you can use, but it's all about reading data from the database. Okay, this is if you already have an object that already exists in your database and you want to take it from a plain old Java object into a persistent Hibernate object, then you invoke the get or the load, or you do a .create criteria, which we talked about a little bit, and you load the object from the database via the Hibernate's API, via Hibernate's methods that you can call, and that brings it into a persistent state. Okay, and remember, persistent state means it's going to be synchronized inside of your transaction. So this happens when you create find type methods or get type methods. So inside of your DAO, you can say find users by ID or get users by ID or whatever the terminology you want to use is, and you pass in an actual ID. Okay, whether it's an ID like an actual physical identifier like a number, or it could be a get user by username. You could pass in a string or something. In any case, when you invoke you do a session dot get or session dot load or session dot create criteria, whatever suits your fancy, and you actually load the object based on its ID or based on its username or whatever, you're bringing it from the database via the Hibernate methods into existence. So you're populating a Java object, but it's also pulling it into a persistent state. Okay, so that's another way from going from transient to persistent, is by loading existing data from the database, which makes sense, right? Being in a persistent state means that Hibernate is in some way interacting with a database, and it's synchronized. It's in tune with the database and your Java code. Your Java code is in harmony with your database via Hibernate. Okay, so the harmonic state, the beautiful state, is when you have a persistent object. Okay, in a persistent state, right? So then you can do whatever you like with it. So you load it from the database, and you can modify it if you like. As soon as the transaction closes, it will synchronize it again, and there you have it. Then it goes from being persistent to a detached object. Okay, and then if you want to go from detached back to persistent, you need to update it or you need to merge it. Sound good? So that's the way you can move around the life cycle of these Hibernate objects. Now, there's one more position you could be in. There's one more state that you can be in, and that is called the removed state. So the removed state occurs when when you're in a persistent state, and you move from persistent to removed. So let's say you have loaded an object, or you've just saved an object. That object is in a persistent state. The Hibernate has its eye on it. It knows what's going on, and you invoke a delete on it. So you say session.delete, and you pass in that persistent object. Hibernate says, okay, I'm fully aware of what's going on with this object as it pertains to my transaction. I see that you want to delete it from the database. You've issued the delete statement or the remove statement, and so I will bow to your wishes and I will delete it from the database. So it will do so. It will delete that object from the database. It'll delete the row, the corresponding row, and maybe if there's any cascading effects going on, if you've used your cascade all annotation that we've learned about in past episodes, then it will cascade delete through what it needs to do. All right. So there you have it. Then we've moved from a persistent state to a removed state. And once you're in a removed state, you do not want to deal with that object anymore. You want to make sure that object is null. Okay. You want to make sure that you don't change that object, because it just wouldn't make any sense. You've deleted it. It doesn't exist in the database anymore. So why are you, handling it any further? You should just, let it get collected by the garbage collection of Java and make it null and move on with it, right? And I mean, typically, you don't have to make it null. What happens is you pass in that object via your service method. Again, you say .delete inside of your DAO, and it will delete it. And then you just, ignore that object from now on, and you just don't use it again, and it'll get garbage collected on its own via the frameworks that you're using, the Hibernate and the Spring frameworks. Okay, so. And that's pretty much it. That's all of the different states that you can be in. That's the complete life cycle and how you can navigate between each different area of the Hibernate life cycle. Okay, it all comes back to persistent. Persistent is the most effective, important state as it pertains to Hibernate, because persistent state is where all the magic happens and it stays synchronized with the database. Okay, and it's, again, via the transactional code, the boilerplate code that you don't actually have to write, that is written for you in the background via the @transactional annotation inside of Spring itself. Okay, cool. So what I've done is I've put together a little sort of diagram that you can see how to sort of navigate between all the different states, and it's a very handy thing to have. You can sort of, print it off and put it on your wall type of thing. Very, very, good little quick reference card, if you will, on the different states, the life cycles of a Hibernate object. So if you're interested in that, if you want to grab that copy of that, you go to the show notes for this particular session, which is howtoprogramwithjava.com/session58. And you can go to that URL and you can download that little cheat sheet, and you can print it off and put it on your wall and say, impress your mom, impress your friends, and say, look, I understand what the heck that diagram is talking about now. I know how to use Hibernate. I understand the life cycle of a Hibernate object as it pertains to a transactional context. And you can watch the mouths of your friends gaping wide, drop open, and their eyes sort of glaze over and say, I don't know what the heck you're talking about. You clearly are a smarter person than me. And that's the goal of being a programmer, isn't it? To be smarter than everybody else. No, God, no. Don't be like that. So go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/session58. You can download that diagram for yourself, print it off, put it on your wall, and be proud of yourself. So thank you very much for joining me in this session. I'm going to go back now and probably eat something, because I haven't eaten in a long time because I've been puppy sitting. Thankfully, the fiancée just got home, so she's been handling the puppy. But now I will go back and resume my new fatherly duties and help her make some dinner and whatnot. So time to eat. Have a great evening or morning or afternoon or whatever it is for you guys. Thank you very much for listening. Take care of yourselves, and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the How to Program with Java podcast. Please visit howtoprogramwithjava.com for more useful Java tutorials.